Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to a special edition of Maritime Conversations in which we transition from the maritime domain to a dry service one. I am Neha, a researcher and archivist at Maritime Knowledge Syndicate, MARCS, and Merasi. MARCS is an initiative of a few maritime enthusiasts to enhance maritime consciousness in India by bridging the gaps in our maritime knowledge. A boutique venture, it seeks to focus on public outreach, advocacy, and research in pursuit of its objectives. The three areas it is currently engaged with to create subject awareness are Maritime Conversations, a YouTube show, maritime education, and maritime consultancy. Mirasi is a research and archiving firm dedicated to documenting inheritance, establishing repositories, conducting archival research to support the production of films, books, exhibitions, events, and more. They play a vital role in preserving material culture, offering curatorial support, and providing storage solutions. Today's special episode of Maritime Conversation holds great significance as we pay tribute to the valorous efforts of those who served in the Indian Peacekeeping Force (IPKF). On this day in 1987, history witnessed the signing of the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord that aimed to end the brutal civil war with the deployment of the IPKF, demanding unwavering sense of duty, resilience, and upholding humanitarian values. The warriors faced numerous challenges as they navigated an unfamiliar landscape, both physically and politically, to protect innocent lives, facilitate disarmament of various militant groups, and contribute to a peaceful resolution. The IPK's experiences have not only shaped our military doctrine but also broadened our understanding of conflict resolution and the complexities of peacekeeping operations. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our distinguished panelists from the Indian Army, Navy, and Air Force today, all of whom played a vital role in the peacekeeping operations in Sri Lanka. I extend my warm welcome to Colonel R.S. Sidhu, Sena Medal. Colonel Sidhu is a postgraduate in history from Delhi University and a veteran from the Army's Mechanized Infantry Regiment with extensive operational service in wide-ranging terrain. He has hands-on experience of dealing with various facets of the IPKF operations from 1987 to 1990 in Sri Lanka, where he had the rare opportunity to serve in all the four sectors. His recently published book, The Mechanized Force in Operation Pawan, is a very incisive saga on the IPKF operations in Sri Lanka. He is a strategic thinker and has authored 4 books on diverse subjects, published several articles on strategic affairs in magazines and journals. Thank you for joining us, Colonel Sidhu. I now welcome Lieutenant Colonel Manoj Chandan, a veteran from 65 Armored Regiment, who was deployed for nearly 2 years as part of IPKF in Jaffna, Trincomalee, and Batticaloa sectors in Sri Lanka. He is also privileged to raise a counter-terrorist training school at Bhadarwah in Jammu and Kashmir. Post his army service, he has served in the corporate world for 12 years and is currently an independent business consultant on defense and strategy, aviation, land systems, homeland security, and counterterrorism.
Post his army service, he has served in the corporate world for 12 years and is currently an independent business consultant on defense and strategy, aviation, land systems, homeland security, and counterterrorism. He's a regular contributor to prestigious journals and periodicals on defense, security, and strategic matters, and is an active participant on live talk shows in visual media. Thank you for joining us, Colonel Chanan.
Thank you, Neha. Good to be on the program.
I welcome aboard Commodore Anil Joseph. Commodore Anil Joseph N. Vishishta Seva Medal was commissioned into the Indian Navy in 1986, and within a year he saw service in Operation Pawan as part of the Indian Naval Liaison Team (INLT). He was involved in active maritime operations, including beaching operations in the Gulf of Mannar and Park Strait, on board INS Cheetah and Karwar, and inshore minesweepers. He rose in the Indian Navy as an anti-submarine warfare specialist. He is a graduate of the DSSC, Army War College, and the National Defence College. Commodore Joseph has the distinction of commanding several Indian naval ships, naval stations, and has also held the prestigious appointment of Director, Maritime Warfare Center.
He superannuated in October 21 as a commanding officer of INS Venduruti and station commander Kochi. He's an avid reader and writer, a good sportsman, and active mentor counselor, and is actively engaged in talks and lectures in educational institutions. Thank you for joining us, Commodore Joseph.
Thank you, Neha.
To this group of eminent panelists, I now welcome Air Commodore Nitin Sathe, who was commissioned as a helicopter pilot into the Indian Air Force in December 1984 and has flown almost 6,000 hours on varied helicopters. He has been privileged to command an attack helicopter squadron in the war-torn Congo in 2006-2007 and Indian Air Force bases in operational and insurgency-prone areas. A prolific author, he writes and speaks for various media fora as well as participates in seminars and symposiums on military topics. His research work on the history of helicopters, including the air operations during Operation Pawan in Sri Lanka, has been incorporated in the book IAF in its centennial decade, published by the Center for Air Power Studies.
Currently, he is engaged in training the young generations to join the armed forces and in philanthropic activities for the disabled. Thank you for joining us, Air Commodore Sathe.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you for getting me on.
As we navigate through this special episode of Maritime Conversations, let us approach it with open hearts and minds, seeking to learn, appreciate, and honor the legacy of the Indian Peacekeeping Force. May this event serve as a catalyst for further dialogue, introspection, and collective growth as we strive to foster for a more peaceful and harmonious world. On behalf of everyone gathered here, I extend my gratitude to our esteemed panelists for joining us today. We are fortunate enough to have Colonel Sidhu as the moderator for this session. I now request Colonel Sidhu to take the floor.
The most unique and challenging period in the history of Indian military and for India itself. This was the time when there was a full-blown insurgency which was going on in Punjab, also in J&K, which was covertly supported from across the western borders. Pakistan was also preparing to activate the Siachen front, which was unoccupied at that point of time. China was putting pressure along the northern borders. Sri Lanka was coming up as a hotspot because of the Tamil issue in that country and the Sri Lankan Navy activities in the Park Strait. And how was this challenge met by India and its military? It was by taking the fight, not exactly the fight, but the issues proactively. So we carried out exercise brass tacks to put Pakistan into its place. In 1986, 1984, we activated the Siachen Glacier to preempt the Pakistan occupation of the Saltoro Ridge lines. And in Arunachal Pradesh, we heli-landed an entire infantry brigade to put pressure onto the Chinese intrusions in that area. Thereafter, we also carried out the peacekeeping intervention in Sri Lanka from 1987 to 1990, while also carrying out counter-piracy operations to save the government of Maldives, which was a friendly government at that point of time. So when we look at it with hindsight, and in the current geopolitical context, it was a mind-boggling 3.5 fronts activation across all the borders of India at that point of time. And mind you, at that time, our military did not have the strength that we have developed at this point of time, comparison to the adversaries which we were facing at that point of time. So, keeping all this situation as the backdrop, we shall be discussing Operation Pawan, the Indian peacekeeping force operations in Sri Lanka, which commenced in on 29th of July 1987 with the signing of the Indo-Sri Lanka peacekeeping agreement and terminated on 24th of March 1990 when the last Indian peacekeeping soldier de-inducted from the island and returned to the mainland. This is one of the largest, rather the largest tri-service operation which has been conducted post the 1971 war that led to the establishment of the headquarters Indian Peacekeeping Force, a tri-service organization with nearly 1 lakh troops from the three services under its command. This 32 months long politico-military, I intentionally call it politico-military because it was not a straightforward military operation. Uh, the intensity of this peacekeeping operation is best gauged from the gallantry awards bestowed and the casualties suffered by the force, despite it being termed as a peacekeeping operation. The IPKF was awarded one Paramveer Chakra, 6 Mahavir Chakras, 98 Veer Chakras, and a score of other gallantry awards. And nearly 200 Indian soldiers were killed in action, while approximately 3,000 soldiers were seriously injured. So, at this point of time, I will now request Manoj Chanan to share with the viewers and us that what were the issues involved before the commencement of the Indian peacekeeping operations, how it impacted the security of India, and what forced India to intervene in the island. Colonel Manoj?
The Indian peacekeeping operations, which commenced in July 1987, there were a number of reasons for our intervention. Primarily, it was keeping in mind our southern states and their interests of brethren across in Sri Lanka, in which we wanted to protect the interests of the Sri Lankan Tamils to ensure that they are not put under pressure by the Sri Lankan government and their rights were restricted by the parliament soon after their independence. As you would be aware, soon after independence, the Sri Lankan government had passed a resolution in which it made Sinhala as its primary language, and their Tamils were being treated as second-class citizens. This resulted in a number of Tamil-based political parties coming up, and with the passage of time, these became more militant to achieve their overall aim of having equality in their own country. India was forced to intervene because of its political reasons to ensure that our southern states are not caught in this Tamil Elam wave that was going through Sri Lanka. At the same time, because of the operations going on by the Sri Lankan army, which were not going off very well against the LTTE, there was a fear that countries inimical to India's interests like China, Pakistan, or the Britishers would step in into a neighborhood and assist the Sri Lankans. So therefore, it was decided that India would intervene and sort of discussed with the Sri Lankan government to sign the peace accord, and thereafter it went in on 29th of July 87.
At this point, I'll go back to Neha, who's our host for the event. Neha, from the perspective of your carrying out the doctoral thesis on the ethnic conflict, would you like to raise a query on this subject before we proceed further?
Yes, the India-Sri Lanka Agreement of 29 July 1987 formed the basis for the deployment of the Indian peacekeeping forces in Sri Lanka. How did it come about, and what were the key military and political clauses of this agreement?
For the knowledge of the viewers, it would be pertinent to note that the Indian government was planning a military intervention into Sri Lanka by a sort that was being planned by the three services. My own assessment is that probably a whiff of this information was shared with the Sri Lankans, and the wily Jayawardene, who was the president of Sri Lanka at that time, immediately sought an audience with the Prime Minister of India through his foreign ministry to look for a plausible solution to avoiding this conflict. And this Indo-Sri Lanka peace accord was very quickly drafted and signed, in which primarily it was stated that the unity of Sri Lanka will not be disturbed, and Indian government and the armed forces would be responsible for healing in all the militant organizations, and we were to underwrite this commitment on the Sri Lanka Accord. So primarily it was that we would assist in the political elections in the northern and eastern provinces. We will not go beyond the northern and eastern provinces and intervene in any other issues of the Sri Lankan government. And therefore, while the agreement was looked upon as a major breakthrough, there was a lot of opposition to it within the Sri Lankan political scenario at that point of time, because the opposition of Mr. Jayawardene felt that this was primarily compromising on the sovereignty of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Manoj. Just to add on onto it, as far as the political aspects of the agreement were concerned, the first was that the northern and the eastern provinces, they will be made one unitary province. There will be elections to the this unitary province, northeastern province, within a given time frame, and subsequently whether this a unitary province will remain unitary will be dependent on a vote which will be taken in the northeastern provinces, again within a given time frame, and the Tamil language and the other issues will be carried out, will be resolved by the Sri Lankan government by carrying out an amendment to their constitution. Militarily, the India was required to provide a military task force to underwrite the government and to ensure that all the involved parties in it, they adhere to the accord. So India was something like a guarantor to the accord, and there were very specific time frames which are allotted as to when the IPKF, within how much time of the arrival of the IPKF, the weapons will be surrendered, and when will the Sri Lankan security forces revert back to their barracks and not be deployed, and what was the IPKF mandated area, that is the northern and the eastern provinces, in which the IPKF writ will be implemented. So apart from this, before we went into the signing of the agreement, there was Sri Lankan government was delaying the whole process. So there was an escalatory curve which was carried out by the Indian government, from first attempting a political solution which was being delayed by the Sri Lankan government. It was thereafter proceeded by attempts at providing humanitarian assistance, culminating in a conventional military intervention. So procrastination by the Sri Lankan government on finding a political solution to resolve the persecution of the Tamil ethnic minority forced the Indian government to take the next escalatory step, which was the humanitarian assistance. May I request Commodore Joseph as to what was the first attempt at delivering humanitarian assistance to the beleaguered population of the Jaffna through a flotilla of ships? Who organized it and what was its outcome? Commodore Joseph?
Yes, sir. Actually, that is something many do not even realize that there were ships actually already deployed even before the accord was signed. This is a unique characteristic of the Navy. That is what we call as flexibility, that one can deploy units without even raising any alarm. Unlike any mobilization that would say happen in the Army or the Air Force, a mobilization would trigger alarm bells. When ships sail out, even in peacetime, the ships are prepared for every contingency. A ship at sea can change from a peacetime role to one of war in a jiffy. So, as tensions mounted, ships were deployed to patrol in our areas of concern, essentially along the Tamil Nadu coast, the Gulf of Mannar, the Park Bay, and so on. Units from the Southern Naval Command, basically the inshore minesweepers, two of them, they were deployed in the Gulf of Mannar. Ships from the Eastern Naval Command, initially the seaward defense boats, what we call as SDBs, they operated out of Chennai for Park Bay. The deployments, our role, which was a mix of watching the scenario, making our presence felt, providing succor, providing humanitarian assistance, a show, basically a show of our commitment and resolve that we are there for you for any eventuality. Unknown to many, actually, there were many young officers, a few young officers, mostly Malayalis and Tamilian officers. They were ashore. They were ashore on short stints, basically getting a pulse on the ground. There are many anecdotes about these, but I can just simply say we lived with the fishing communities, and believe it or not, the people were extremely cordial and friendly in those days. Just to put it very, very simply, there was plenty happening even before the accord was signed. Essentially, one can call it a preparatory or an anticipatory action with ships and a few personnel in our areas of interest.
So once this flotilla of the small ships which was carrying the humanitarian aid was stopped by the Sri Lankan Navy in the Park Strait, India had no choice but to further escalate the matter, and it launched Operation Pumalai. So, Air Commodore Nitin Sathe, may I request you to share the details of Operation Pumalai?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Thanks for getting me in here. And just further to what was said earlier about what was happening in Sri Lanka, the Jaffna was the area where a whole amount of action was taking place. The whip actually was being applied maximum by the Sri Lankan government on Jaffna, and Chandan will agree with me that about 1,000 odd civilians had died just in the beginning of June 1987. So they were actually fishing boats escorted by a Coast Guard ship. They were stopped in the Sri Lankan waters and sent back after a 4-hour standoff. These guys, the boats came back. The Rajiv Gandhi government decided that we must continue this intervention in terms of humanitarian aid, and that's why the concept of this operation was evolved. Like Pumalai means garland, it means flower garland. So we were sending some flowers to Sri Lanka as for peace. So it was also called Eagle Mission 4 on the Air Force side, and on the 4th of June 1987, this entire plan was opened up, and there was also some pressure by the Indian Tamils on the Prime Minister, saying that you acted when the Bangladeshis came and you acted so fast. Now this is a problem in Sri Lanka. Why are you not doing anything? So there was a lot of political pressure also coming on to the government, and so this operation was launched, and there were 5 AN-32s ex-Agra, 5 of them AN-32s ex-Agra, led by their commanding officer, and there were 6 Mirage 2000s from Gwalior 7th Squadron, which were positioned much earlier down south near Bangalore. And these 5 aircrafts took off, came to Bangalore, filled in 25 tons of load, and which included kerosene, milk, vegetables, and the daily requirements. And the landing ground was chosen about 7 kilometers from Jaffna. It was about 7 kilometers from Jaffna town. And what happened was, since the distance from the coast, Indian coast to the Sri Lankan coast was a little large and RT contact would not be possible, the four AN-32s flew in at 12,000 feet with this load. And also, of course, I forgot, we had 24 foreign and Indian journalists on board to show them that it was actually a humanitarian mission. So that the world we would know that we're not doing any intervention of military intervention at that point in time. These aircrafts took off. They descended to about 1,500 feet under guidance of the Mirage 2000. And in the meanwhile, at 4 o'clock in the evening, the commissioner in Delhi was Bernard Tilakaratne. He was called by the External Affairs Ministry, and he was told that such and such operation is taking place, and in case the Sri Lankan Air Force tries to intervene, we will shoot them down. So that was kind of a veiled warning that was given that this mission has to go through. It is a humanitarian mission and it has to go through. But the amount of load that was dropped over Jaffna was just about 25 tons, and it was not really sufficient to look after the requirements of that the entire massive Tamil population there. Of course, at the end, Sri Lanka accused India of violating its sovereignty, and we all defended it by saying it was a mercy mission. All that thing started, and finally, actually, this was a kind of a pressure building for them to come on board and sign the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord at a later stage. So that, of course, we will discuss a little later, I suppose. Just one more addition that I want to do here is that for the radio relay, there were an additional two Mirage 2000s were with the N-32s. One was flying over the sea to radio relay in case required. Two N-32s were flying over the Indian coastline and monitoring this entire progress of this operation. And by sunset on 4th of June, all the four aircrafts which had gone in landed back at Bangalore, mission completed.
Thank you, Air Commodore Nathan. So, as has just emerged, that apart from the humanitarian mission, another important aspect of this Operation Pumalai was to send a geopolitical signal to the Sri Lankan government that the Indian government was losing patience with their delaying tactics. Finally, it led to the signing of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord on 29th of July 1987, and the very same night, the Indian peacekeeping force started moving and landing in Sri Lanka next day. So there were multifarious units which were involved. The Navy was involved, the Air Force was involved. So we will first start off with the land aspects as to what all were the land forces which were initially inducted and how were they inducted. I will request Colonel Manoj Chanan to come out with these aspects.
The induction of the Indian peacekeeping force is a very interesting chapter because a few facets are really not known to the general public. One is, of course, the fact that prior to the signing of the accord, as has been brought out earlier in the show, that the Indian defense forces were actually poised for an armed intervention and not for peacekeeping. And these orders were changed much late at night on night 28-29th after the peace accord was signed. And the first people to be landed into Jaffna were this 8th Battalion Maha Regiment, which when they went in from being told to be prepared to go in for heliborne operations to now at 2 o'clock in the morning switching over to now being ferried across by N-32s to be landed at Palali airfield is something which I think the viewers need to understand the flexibility and the adaptability of the armed forces. The major induction took place both by air and by sea, in which the Maritime ships like Akbar were also used along with the NSTs of the Indian Navy. The IL-76s were used for ferrying tanks and troops into Jaffna directly. Of course, tanks came in much later in October, but other than that, as Colonel Sidhu would explain later, is that the seaborne launch of BMPs was also taken towards KKS port, where they actually swam across the sea for induction. And the initial period of induction, of course, was for just peacekeeping operations. So, not very heavy equipment in terms of land platforms were really inducted. So, infantry was inducted with its basic weapon systems and their first line ammunition. All the others were held on the mainland just to see as to how the situation develops for the next couple of months before they were to be inducted.
Thank you, Colonel Manoj. So, with the initial induction, 54 Infantry Division, which was at the time located in Secunderabad, and its brigades at various other stations, were inducted into the island with two infantry brigades being deployed in the Jaffna Peninsula and one infantry brigade being deployed in Trincomalee, Batticaloa sector. 54 Infantry Division was reinforced by 10 para commandos, a special force battalion at that point of time, and by 15 mechanized infantry battalion, which was inducted with one company being carrying out amphibious landing at Jaffna coast near Kankesh Thurai. Another mechanized infantry company, along with the battalion headquarters, being air landed at Palali airfield. And the third mechanized infantry company was transported by LSTs and merchant vehicle to Trincomalee for deployment, along with 76 Infantry Brigade of 54 Infantry Division in Batticaloa, Trincomalee sector. So we see that though it appears very simple, but it was quite a complex operation because there were a number of airfields, air stations, military stations, and naval stations which were involved. And to coordinate the movement of all these forces was a very complicated effort. So at this stage, I will request Commodore Joseph to talk about the naval effort for the induction of the Indian peacekeeping force.
Yes, sir. That is something a lot of people need to realize actually. And very simply said, the proof of the pudding is in the action. For actually within a day of signing of the accord, the first two army battalions were transported to Kanake-Santurai. That is on 30th July itself. Like I said earlier, ships were there even before the accord was signed. But once the accord was signed, a number of ships more were deployed in the Gulf of Mannar, the Park Bay, along the entire east coast of Sri Lanka and the Tamil Nadu coast. Indian naval personnel were deployed to Kanake-Santurai, to Trincomalee, Batticaloa, Palali, to set up what was called as Indian Naval Liaison Teams. Most of them were young officers, giving them all a very, very unique experience. The landing ships at first mainly Cheetah, Mahish and Gundar, besides transporting troops, equipment, material and stores, also did operational beachings. We actually did operational beachings at Kanake-Santurai, North and South Batticaloa. Operational beaching implies that we actually relied on the beach survey provided by the combat beach recce teams on intelligence and charts, unlike the elaborate beach surveys that we normally do when we undertake beaching operations. And when we went in for these beachings, we were expecting enemy fire. That nothing happened was pure providence. The airstrip at Ramnad was activated. Coast Guard support was mobilized to support the Navy. Small harbors all along the Tamil Nadu coast, these were all activated with naval presence. Fishing trawlers, most of them armed, were hired to patrol close to the coast. Merchant ships were requisitioned for support for transportation of men and material. The quantum of maritime effort, as is recorded in our own naval archives, it amounts to 5,670 days of patrol by Indian naval and coast guard ships. close to 8,000 days of patrol by the armed trawlers, close to 8,500 hours of flying, 505 sorties by the merchant ships. As you can see, sir, the quantum of maritime effort just from our recorded data is itself very, very substantial.
Thank you, Commodore Joseph. I also personally had the experience to be inducted into the island on the LSTs from Chennai, at the time known as Madras, to Trincomalee, and subsequently to conduct amphibious landing on the LSTs from Trincomalee to Jaffna when the balloon went up in October 1987. And I must say that it's a challenge to be on the LSTs. It's a flat bottomed ship, and one has to have a really strong stomach to survive the 12 to 24 hours that one has to be on it. My compliments to the crew who are accustomed to it. Thank you. And
What you see
thereafter,
behind me is Highness Cheetah, sir.
oh, thanks a lot. I remember there was INS Magar came in at a later phase, I think, which could carry a full squadron of T-72s after slight modification. And at that point of time, there was INS Mahesh. I remember traveling on that, inducted on that at some point of time. So similarly with the Air Force, I had the privilege to first move on a special mission, this thing on an IL-76 before it got aborted airborne. And later on, when the operations were fully on, while on this returning from leave, I was moving in one of these courier aircraft, which was to fly to Wavonia from Madras, but somehow there was a VVIP movement on that, which was planned at the last minute. So suddenly we found the GOC IPKF Lieutenant General A.S. Kalkat and Shri Jain Dishkit, the High Commissioner of India at Colombo, also moving with us. So the plane was diverted to Colombo. So when I was planned to move to Colombo for an operational mission, that got aborted. But this surprise mission finally made me land at Colombo. Though of course I didn't disembark, but it did give me and the other officers on the flight roughly around an hour's time to chat with Shri Jain Dixit to find out about the nuances of the diplomatic aspects of the Operation Pawan. So I will request Air Commodore Nitin to share with us the complexities and the effort of the launched by the Indian Air Force for conducting the induction of the initial elements of the Indian peacekeeping force into Sri Lanka and the supporting mission at that point of time.
Sidhu sir has very clearly brought out the flexibility of the Air Force. I'm reminded of a time when I was going on a 5 days leave from Chabua in the northeast to Pune. I got airborne in an aircraft which was coming to Bombay, and I landed in Vizag. And I finished my leave somewhere down south and went back, because the aircrafts kept getting diverted from one place to the other. Coming back to what you were saying about the operations in Sri Lanka, the naval aspect, of course, you have a bad ride in a LST, but the Air Force aircraft give you a little better, smoother ride, but noisy ride at that. So we started, of course, straight away on 30th of July 1987. This was the largest scale of aircraft being used to transport troops. Almost 10,000 troops were transported in the first phase. And from since World War II, no other air forces in the world had ever taken up such a huge task. So you will imagine the kind of aircraft that were required to transport such large number of troops. We had the IL-76s carrying 40 tons. We had the AN-32 carrying 6 tons. We had the Avros carrying just about 28 passengers or so. With their, of course, their second line ammunition. We had the Doniers, which were carrying just a very few people on board. So all in all the aircraft possible, the AN-12s are on their last leg. The AN-12s were also utilized, some of them, to transport the troops. Besides this, the Indian Airlines were requisitioned. We had the Indian Airlines aircraft which were requisitioned by the Air Force to transport these troops, which is part of the national strategy in any case. So there's an incident that I would like to relate here about this, that the troops were traveling and the commanding officer with the troops, the air hostesses and all were very, they were very numb and they were not talking to anybody and they were very glum. The commanding officer went and told the crew of the aircraft, please treat my men well. These guys are going fresh into battle. They might come back without their limbs. They might not come back at all. So please be nice to them and please lift up their morale. So whatever happened later was, of course, they were treated very well on board, and when they got off, they applied tika to their to their foreheads when they were getting off the flight. This was narrated to be by one of the one of the pilots who was there on board the aircraft, which was getting ferried in. Right. So we had 54 infantry initially, essentially first coming in about 10,000 people, and the induction started from many bases. It was Secunderabad, Gwalior, Lucknow, Allahabad, Kanpur. So the aircraft flew in waves. When a big aircraft has to go in and land at a place to drop troops or pick up troops, the train cannot be very long. Time on ground has to be minimum because the parking slots available on ground are also very less. So the entire operation has to be planned clockwork type, and the aircraft have to maintain to their time frames. Initially, the Air Force also gave Mirage 2000 escorts to the transport aircraft going in. However, at a later stage, after our troops were well set on ground, this was discontinued, and our aircraft flew in with impunity. There was no problem in the air as far as the anti-aircraft issues are concerned. As far as the tonnage is concerned, I have written it down. We did about 3,900 tons of load and 800 sorties and 24,000 troops, which includes the de-induction. I also checked with air headquarters. They do not have the exact numbers for induction and de-induction. This is the total plan that they have. Is in de-induction. Induction is about 24,000 troops, and so many tons. 800 sorties were flown for this induction. And of course, the AN-32 was we'll be talking about it a little later. They flew 6,200 sorties and 150,000 troops, during the entire stay in Sri Lanka. So that's all about the air effort that was required.
So by end of August 1987, the Indian peacekeeping force had settled down for carrying out the peacekeeping operations, but it was becoming clear that the LTT, which was the dominant militant group in Sri Lanka, was playing truant by not surrendering its weapons. They are required to be surrendered within 72 hours of the landing of the IPKF, but a month had elapsed, and a token weapons, which were also non-usable type, had been surrendered by them, and bulk of their overwhelming bulk of their weapons had not been surrendered. So the Indian government and as well as the Sri Lankan government were losing patience with the LTT, and the first sign of this was with the induction of 36th Infantry Division and 340 Infantry Brigade, Independent Infantry Brigade into Trincomalee. This was followed by by the commencement of active operations by Indian peacekeeping force against the LTT in October 1987. So the initial military operations which were executed this thing against the LTT was by a reinforced 54 Infantry Division. I will request Colonel Manoj Janan to share the conduct and the impact of these operations, initial operations from October to December 1987. Colonel Manoj?
Thank you, sir. The operations that commenced in October, rather precisely 10th October 1987, it was a situation of a complete fog of war. To actually explain it to the viewers, At that time, as Colonel Sidhu and the other speakers have brought out, the peacekeeping operations were on. Uh, Efforts were being made to request or tell the LTT and other militant groups to sort of surrender their weapons, which they of course did, but they surrendered unserviceable weapons. And at that point of time, the Sri Lankan Navy had apprehended about 17 uh, militants of the LTTE, and they had been brought into the Jaffna or rather Palali field. And there was a lot of pressure being put onto the Indian peacekeeping force to initiate action and allow these militants to be, or terrorists to be taken back to Colombo, which of course the IPKF was not very keen to allow to do so. And the aircraft that they were sort of being kept on board was also surrounded by the 10th Para Special Forces commandos to ensure that the aircraft does not leave Palani. The entire debacle took place when meals were sent in and these 17 people consumed cyanide capsules. And that was when the balloon actually went up. The points to note is not only the fact that how the operations were launched. It was assumed that the Indian peacekeeping force, being very highly trained, would very quickly and swiftly move in into Jaffna town and sort of apprehend all the LTTE cadres and bring them to heel. Unfortunately, at that point of time, there are a few aspects that we have to bear in mind. The entire, most of the IPKF force which was there on the island had just de-inducted from Operation Brass Tacks, which was a conventional military operation, and the training was focused towards an adversary on our western borders. Now, having come into Sri Lanka, the modus operandi of operations took a complete turn on its head. Firstly, it was jungle terrain. It was full of lagoons, very high water table, and movement was restricted to roads and tracks. The LTT had been preparing for such an eventuality from the time the IPKF had landed on 29th of July. And we, I think, as a part of the IPKF, did not prepare for this contingency that the operations would have to be undertaken and they would have to be fought against. To cut this narrative short, the operations were launched along the road axis from Palali towards Jaffna, and at the same time, another axis opened up along the coastal route. Primarily, 41 Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Bantu was moving along this, and I will not get into the detailed deployment of units and which all were the ones which sort of led the advance towards Jaffna. The aspects that need to be brought out are that there was very little intelligence, there were no maps, and as the additional troops were being inducted in, and especially by regiment, 65 Armored Regiment, when the tanks were being thrown into Jaffna, they were being told to move out along, single tanks were being told to move out with infantry battalions with just one order from the GOC at that time, that go and apprehend Prabhakaran and get him back. Now, you will understand, and the viewers will understand, that this was an ad hoc kind of an operation. It was not a well thought through, planned movement which took place to carry out these operations. The LTT were very, very agile. They would open a fire on our troops which were moving in a line ahead formation, would be susceptible to fire, and the LTT also had laid out a complete set of IEDs, improvised explosive devices. This was a term that was coined during Op Pawan only, and they successfully launched these IEDs against the tanks and ICBs, as well as our B vehicles, in which some of the troops oblique our warlegs to also be transported. There was intense battles fought. The Indian Army, young officers and men, within 72 to 48 hours, 48 to 72 hours, were able to adapt to the new type of engagements they had to do with the LTTE. And very soon, from being caught unawares, they were able to rally and actually start getting success. This entire operation, till the link up at Jaffna Fort, had many great successes, but there were also tremendous losses. In particular, is the heli-drop operation of 13 Sikhalai at the Jaffna University. Uh, we'll not go into the merits and demerits of the operation, but yes, we did lose a platoon of 13 Sikhalai, about 39 to 40 men, and about 6 to 8 special forces combatants, uh, which did impact the morale for some time, but at the same time, it also gave him the uh, Josh to make sure that the entity was completely cleared out of Jaffna. And soon thereafter, when the link-up had taken place, the entity moved away into the jungles of Uvunia. There was an assessment that probably the entity would open up a front towards Trincomalee. And towards the end of December, early January 1988, there were some readjustments and additional inductions that had taken place. And this was the induction of 57 Mountain Div, which was brought into Batiklava, and there was 4 Infantry Div, which was brought into Vupunia. The mechanized portion, that is the 2 mechanized infantry battalions, 15 mech and 13 mech, along with Combat Group 65, were sort of redeployed into 3 combat groups, where a squadron was allocated to 15 mech and they were deployed at Bobunia. Squadron was given to 13 mech and they were deployed at Trincomalee. Combat Group headquarters of 65, along with a company of 13 mech, moved into Batiklava. And prior to our movement that side, there was a company, Charlie company of 17 mech, which had been flown in much prior to the operations into Batiklava to ensure that nothing untoward happens that side. They were subsequently withdrawn out from the operational area, I think in February 1988. So this was the major battles were of course fought in Jaffna till mid-November. Thereafter, the focus of operations actually developed into the jungles of Bunia, which actually became the hotbed for operations for the entire duration of our stay.
Thank you, Colonel Manoj. So, in a nutshell, there were 5 infantry brigades which were converging onto the Jaffna town along 5 different roads to throw the LTT out of the Jaffna Peninsula. And almost 2/3 of the casualties of the Indian peacekeeping force were suffered during this operation. The mechanized forces, by the time 65 Armored Regiment squadron had been brought in, there were 13 mech infantry, 2 companies which had been brought in, and 15 mechanized infantry fully was there. 9 para commandos had also been brought in by the time. And there was the aviation attack helicopters also, which were pressed into service. So by October end, the Jaffna town had been released from the grip of the LTT, and thereafter the LTT leadership started moving, shifting itself to the Vani jungles in Vavunia, and the center of gravity of the operations shifted there. During all this time, we were involved in the operations. We did not stay at one place for even more than one night. We were moving through the day, most of the night also, halting in between, fighting and carrying out all the activities. By February 1988, a major reorganization of the Indian peacekeeping force was done, where 54 Infantry Division was made responsible for the Jaffna Peninsula, 4 Infantry Division was made responsible for the Bavania sector. The 36th Infantry Division was deployed in Trincomalee sector, and 57 Mountain Division was looking after the particular sector. Similarly, the attack helicopters of the IAF, this thing, a troop was also brought in, which proved to be a major deterrent against the LTT. I would request Air Commodore Nitin Sathe to yeah, brief us about the air effort which was done to support the IPKF land operation, and if feasible to give out details of one operation conducted by the attack helicopters, which had a big impact on the overall IPKF mission.
Sir, thank you, sir. Chanan was saying that we had to get Virupallai Prabhakaran. So the Air Force got him on the 24th of July. On the 24th of July, I got a very interesting story. In fact, I was interviewing somebody yesterday, an old AVM retired, and he gave me this very interesting story, which I am now going to publish. It is about a secret mission of Mi-17 helicopters, which came all the way from Hindon, that is Ghaziabad. They flew to down south. Then they flew at low levels over the sea, 4 aircraft. 2 aircraft remained in the air, 2 aircraft went. I'm just giving you a gist of what happened. They landed near a temple at Jaffna, and Prabhakaran, his wife, and 2 children, they were picked up by these helicopters and got back to Chennai, where an aircraft was waiting for Prabhakaran to be taken to Delhi. So after he had some discussions at Chennai with the DMK leaders, he got into this aircraft and went to Delhi. And then, of course, his de-induction was done by AN-32 later. But all in all, the Air Force had him on 24th before the pact was signed between the two governments. That aside, the Air Force likes to keep the air operations in 2 phases. I mean, we have to kind of when we learn about what has happened there, the phase one was what Colonel Sidhu said, till the time Jaffna came under control. That was phase one. There was quite conventional kind of fighting that was going on, and phase two was the jungle fighting, the guerrilla tactics that were used. So the phase two part was a little different for the Indian Air Force. So basically, I'll just bring out a little difficulties, and then we'll come to one of the operations. I like to cover the Jaffna University debacle. I call it a debacle because it was for the Air Force. It was quite a miserable operation that didn't go through in all entirety that it was supposed to. At the larger level, there was a lack of command and control. There was no structured command control. There was a seniority gradient between the Army seniors and the Air Force seniors was so huge that the Air Force guy was unable to speak. There was a squadron leader in charge of a base with 24 men. How could he interact with the major general or a brigade commander for that matter? So that was one big problem that I read about, and of course lack of interaction between services. Now we have come a long way. We've kind of the interaction and the communication. The radio sets were not compatible between the Air Force and the Army. So the communication itself was a big problem. Notwithstanding that, at the tactical level, like somebody mentioned, there were no maps. So quarter and million maps not available to the aircrew. How do you go around navigating to a pinpoint target? That was one. Secondly, the jungle area does not allow us to see anything. You can't see anything that is happening under the cover of the jungle, under the green cover. There were no SOPs that existed about flying over militant infested areas. There were no SOPs at that point in time. We brought out the SOPs as we went along in phase one. Then, of course, was the maps, like I've said. What we did was, incidentally, the Sri Lankan maps that were available were 1939 vintage. 1939 vintage. So they were absolutely very, very old and out of date. So we used the tourist maps from the, there's at Colombo, there was this tourism department of theirs. We picked up all the maps that were possible from them, and we got them and distributed to all the pilots. So these were the tourist maps that we used for flying. And of course, we were flying into unprepared, unknown, unrecceed sites all the time. So the stress levels in the cockpit, especially for the helicopter pilots, was very large. So that is one aspect that one needs to study about, and what I've been talking to a lot of pilots who were flying the Mi-8s at that point in time. There was a Mi-8 that was loaded by our own guys at the helipad, and by mistake, the calculation was done. The Mi-8 was overloaded by 1.2 tons. 1.2 tons of ammunition extra on a Mi-8. You know what would have happened? The aircraft got airborne and it crashed there only. That was the only loss that the Air Force had. The Mi-8 that we lost due to our own, problems at the helipad itself. Thankfully, all were alive, and we did not lose the men out there. Then, of course, the kind of missions that were flown were troop induction, de-induction. We've already spoken about it. Logistics maintenance, quick redeployment, and I would also like to cover the arm role. The Mi-8 also played an arm role. It carried 192 rockets, but they were not very accurate. So, very few missions of the Mi-8 were flown in the arm role. We had a Chetak helicopter which would carry the SS-11B1 that the army has. We had the AS-11B1 which could fire a missile. So that was used against some ships. Again, it was not very successful. The aircraft was de-inducted and used for communication duties. The my squadron, 1 to 5 squadron, inducted with 4 Mi-25s into Jaffna in early, I think September or something, September, mid-September or so. And these were the aircraft that were feared most by the LTT. They used to call it the Mutulai. Mutulai means the alligator. So they called this aircraft the Mutulai. And the first mission that was flown, we were able to neutralize logistics and a bomb logistics base of the LTT, and that led to a good amount of success in terms of morale also for our troops. So whenever our aircraft used to fly, the Mi-35 used to give escort as much as possible, and this enhanced the morale of the men below as well as our own flying machines. The only problem was we had only 3 machines available at any point in time, and they were distributed all over the northern Sri Lanka. So therefore, that was a little problem there. And of course, there's a little story of a fratricide story in which, in phase 2, we were briefed that any vehicle that is moving, you're supposed to fly over it low, and if it stops and the driver comes out with his hands held up in the air, we are not supposed to fire at that vehicle. And otherwise, in phase 1, we were allowed to fire at any vehicle that was moving. So in phase 2, one of our aircraft which got airborne, 2 aircraft got airborne, and they intercepted a bus and some trucks going one behind the other. They intercepted them. They did two rounds over them. The bus and the truck didn't stop. So as per the SOP, we shot into the bus, and unfortunately there were civilians and children and women traveling on that bus, and a large number of lives were lost on that particular. This is one incident that I would like to cover here. Last but not the least, the Jaffna University debacle. 4 helicopters carrying out SHBO by night in an unrecceed, unfamiliar area, and doing the same circuit over and over again 5 times. So there was a huge amount. There were tactical errors. There were errors of planning. But we luckily for the Air Force, only 4 aircraft, all 4 got bullet hits. 1 aircraft was almost a write-off. But we managed to recover all of them in the next 1 week or 10 days. No casualties on the Air Force side, but Sikh Ally and the 10 para-commandos who went into Jaffna University ground that night. There was a huge amount of people who were stranded on ground without reinforcements flying in, because there was confusion at Palali airfield also. There's a big story to that. We'll not get into that, but the Jaffna University ground debacle, it was a lesson for SHBO operations, because we did not kind of learn from what we had learned in the Meghna crossing of 1971. Over to you,
Thank
sir.
you, Ambassador Nitin. Actually, the SHBO at Jaffna University is a namuna how not to conduct a special operation. But nevertheless, you well highlighted the issues I will now request uh, Commodore Joseph to share with us the Marcos operations or the any special operations conducted by the Navy, which had a major impact on the IPKF operations in Sri Lanka.
Aye, sir, that is very noticeable one actually. Uh, Op Pawan or IPKF operation actually it has many tales of courage, tales of grit and determination, humanitarian stories, incidents ranging from friendliness, from peacekeeping to war. Actually, young officers pitched into very new experiences, operational experiences as well. But among all of them, probably the IMSF, the Marcos, the commando arm of the Navy, probably they announced themselves to the world at this stage. Probably this and Op Cactus. That is the time when they announced themselves to the world. The Marcos actually undertook about 55 combat operations, and each one of them, I would think, made a difference. Be it securing the Kanake port with skeleton personnel after the breakout of war, be it the Palai airport attack, the SPS launch at Patikulau, breakout from Jaffna, uh, and during their raids, they destroyed LTT boats, ammunition, warehouses, militant camps. They proved to be a very potent force in flushing out operations in the islands, lagoons, inlets, getting in where others could probably have not got into. There are actually many stories of whalers. I'll just narrow down to one, Mahavir Chakra, because that's the highest award that the Navy got. Commodore Arvind Singh, very good friend and an esteemed senior. He was then a young lieutenant. I will just run through his citation actually, sir. Lieutenant Arvind Singh was the officer in charge of the IMS team, which along with 10 para was given very specific tasks. Lieutenant Arvind Singh, leading a team, broke out from the Jaffna fort at 14:30 hours on 19th October 87. During this operation, the team had to negotiate a heavily mined road with booby traps laid by the militants. The team was under militant fire from buildings and rooftops. Lieutenant Arvind, by his personal example of bravery, motivated his men to secure the area, which resulted in the link up of 41 Brigade with 1 Maratha Lai on 20th October 1987. And the very next day, on the night of 21 October, the IMSF team under his leadership was tasked to destroy the Gurunagar jetty and the militant speedboats in the Jaffna Lagoon. The team actually successfully placed and detonated explosive charges and extensively damaged the jetty and destroyed about 6 boats. In order to destroy the remaining boats, the team reached its destination by swimming over a mile underwater and successfully planted demolition charges on 11 more speedboats, kept ready for the escape of the militants. And before the charges could be exploded, the team came under heavy fire of the militants. So Lieutenant Arvind Singh once again took charge of the situation. He provided a diversion by exposing himself to the militant fire, and this inspired his men who accomplished the task of destroying all the speedboats. Lieutenant Arvind Singh, for this exceptional devotion to duty and gallantry, was awarded the Mahavir Chakra. Like I said, sir, there are many more tales of valor, tales of accomplishment. Always, whenever we talk about such things, I just say one must also remember that for every reported act of heroism, there must be at least five odd others which have not been reported. So spare us thought for that unknown soldier at all these times. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commodore Joseph. So, on 14th of November 1987, the Parliament of Sri Lanka passed the 13th Amendment to the 1978 Constitution of Sri Lanka and the Provincial Councils Act number 42 of 1987 for the establishment of provincial councils. On 8th of September 1988, the provincial councils of the northern and eastern provinces were merged into one entity through a presidential proclamation. The elections of the Northeastern Provincial Council were held on 19th of November 1988, leading to Mr. Vardharaj Perumal of the APRLF being sworn in as the on 10th of December 1988 as the first Chief Minister of the merged Northeastern Province. This was followed by Lieutenant General A.S. Kalkar, GOC IPKF, sending the now famous signal to New Delhi. Mission accomplished, awaiting further instructions. However, he was instructed to carry on with the Indian Peacekeeping Force mission, which subsequently fell foul of the new Sri Lankan government, where Shri Premdasa was elected as the president in place of Shri Jayawardene. He was against the IPKF accord right from the beginning, and he asked for the deinduction of the Indian peacekeeping force. The deinduction of the Indian peacekeeping force after the government of India acceded to it in July 9, in August 1989 commenced after the brief interaction and discussions between the Sri Lankan army and the Indian peacekeeping force as to the modalities of the IPKF. And this is one of the most successfully executed deinduction from a foreign country by any army in the modern era. Even the Russians and the Americans failed thrice. The Russians once in Afghanistan, and the Americans both in the Vietnam and in Afghanistan. It goes to the credit of the Indian peacekeeping force that all the missions, all the aims which were recorded in the Indian peacekeeping force accord, Indo-Sri Lanka accord between India and Sri Lanka, that they were all accomplished, and the Indian peacekeeping force de-inducted from the island on 24th of March 1990. With this, there is one aspect which remains to be discussed or rather talked about or to be shared. That is the legacy of the Indian peacekeeping force operations. I'll request Colonel Manoj Chanan to take a minute to sensitize the viewers about the legacy of the IPKF.
I think it is for the veterans of IPKF to make sure that the legacy is brought forward into the public domain. Unfortunately, because of the documents still being not declassified, the army headquarters has been a little, all the service headquarters have been a little slow in sort of acknowledging that the commemoration of this operation should be done. Just for the knowledge of the viewers, a case has been taken up through the AG's branch army headquarters, and a note has been circulated through them to the other service headquarters for ensuring that a day is allocated for the commemoration. Till such time, an official commemoration date is sort of publicized by the Ministry of Defense. It is we as veterans continue to commemorate the valor of all our colleagues who laid down their lives on the island on 29th of July, and this would be the third year to the efforts of Colonel Atul Kochar that we would be celebrating and commemorating this wonderful legacy of Op Pawan. We have been taking up through other fora also to sort of sensitize the environment that not only Op Pawan but various other military operations which I would not elaborate upon on this webinar also need to be acknowledged. The serviceman did not fight with a political aim. He just carried out his orders, and as per the Shetwood oath that we all take at the Indian Military Academy, we delivered on what we were tasked, and I would leave it at that.
Thank you, Colonel Manoj. I would end up from the side of the panelists by saying that as young officers, it was our karn to lead our men in battle. As veterans, it is our dharma to ensure that the supreme sacrifices made by our men, with whom we led, are not forgotten. The nation may forget its dharma for a while, but I think it will come around, because there is no way that the supreme sacrifices of 1,200 odd killed in action and 3,000 odd with wounded seriously can be forgotten yet unsung. Thank you. I'll request Neha to come up with the final talk of the day.
Distinguished panelists, and to everyone who have joined us today. As we bring this remarkable episode of Maritime Conversations to a close, I stand before you with a heart filled with gratitude and admiration. We have witnessed a truly enlightening and thought-provoking conversation thanks to the incredible insights shared by our panelists. But before we conclude, it is essential that we take a moment to thank those who have made this event possible. First and foremost, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to Colonel Atul Kochar. His unwavering commitment to commemorating the legacy of the IPKF has been the driving force behind this event. It is his efforts that brought together the panelists. Colonel Kochar is the esteemed author of works such as Valiant Deeds, Undying Memories, the Indian Peacekeeping Force in Sri Lanka, and Resurrecting the IPKF Legacy. The devotion shown by individuals like him in preserving the IPKF's history are profoundly inspiring. We are deeply grateful for the invaluable contributions. I would also like to express my heartfelt appreciation to Colonel R. S. Sidhu, whose meticulous planning, insightful framework, and strategic guidance has been instrumental in shaping the success of this panel discussion. His expertise and deep understanding of the subject has laid the foundation of our meaningful conversations. To our esteemed panelists, Colonel Manoj Chandan, Commodore Anil Joseph, and Air Commodore Nitin Sathe, who have shared their experiences and perspective today, I offer my sincerest gratitude. The stories you have shared have not only educated but also inspired us with your bravery, resilience, and dedication. I would now like to thank Commodore Shrikant Kesner of Maritime Knowledge Syndicate, whose efforts have provided us with this platform. I would also like to acknowledge the entire Marks and Mirasi team, whose hard work, thorough planning, and attention to detail have been instrumental in bringing this event to a fruition. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that today's special edition of Maritime Conversations has been a testament to the legacy of the IPKF. It is our duty to honor their memory, ensure their stories are preserved for posterity, and continue to strive for a more peaceful world. Once again, I express my gratitude to Colonel Kochar, the panelists, and Marks and Marasi team. May the spirit of IPKF's legacy live on, guiding us towards a better, brighter, and a more harmonious future. To the audience, I would appreciate if you could write to us on maritimeconversations@gmail.com and let us know what would you like for us to discuss in the upcoming episodes. Do not forget to subscribe to our social media handles, our YouTube and Spotify channels for more events. Thank you.